Hi, welcome to episode 60 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in, we're using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whidden, here in Brooklyn, New York, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. Today, I'm so very delighted to be joined by Matt Smith. Matt is a Coast Guard veteran who lives in New Jersey and is currently learning how to fly airplanes. We know each other from our days at Smithtown High School East out on Long Island way back in the day. Matt, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing, and could you share a bit of your story?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really pleased to be here. Well, good morning, Michael, and good morning, everybody. Like you said, we went to high school together on Long Island. Had that sort of interesting, maybe sheltered by some people's definition, childhood. And y- after I graduated in 1989, I went to the United States Coast Guard Academy up in New London, Connecticut, which is kind of like a smaller version of West Point, Annapolis, kind of the same deal. And so that was a 4-year program. Graduated there with a bachelor's degree in engineering and commissioned as an ensign in the U.S. Coast Guard. And from there, I went to a buoy tender down in Florida. For people who don't know what a buoy tender is, it's basically a ship that has a working deck and a crane up forward for all those big lighted buoys that you see when you're out on your boat or on a ship or something. Well, somebody's got to go out there and pick those things up and repaint them and make sure the lights work and make sure they're all set and they're in the right spot. And we do that. So it was a fantastic, especially for a young guy, kind of like wanting a little bit of adventure. All up and down the Florida coast, out to Puerto Rico, St. Thomas, Virgin Islands. So it was a fantastic. I mean, it's a good way to make a living. Yeah.
Wow, that was a great there. We could stop this, and it would be a great recruiting commercial.
That's right. And listen, we are hiring. So go coastguard.com, right? That's my one sales pitch. Uh, so I did that for 2 years, and I had sort of that permanent baked-in suntan from that. And so the Coast Guard decided my next challenge should be to go to an icebreaker on the Great Lakes. So it was sort of the exact opposite. I was on a little 140-foot icebreaking tug up there, keeping. A lot of people probably don't realize how much shipping goes on in the Great Lakes, and they want to run through the winter. Doing feeding the steel mills or coal for power plants and that sort of stuff. So I spent 2 years up there as executive officer, kind of second in command of this little icebreaking tug on the Great Lakes, which was a lot of it was a lot of responsibility for. I was a 23-year-old kid basically, but it was awesome. So I did that for 2 years. From there, I went ashore. I went back to the Coast Guard Academy to teach classes. I was teaching navigation and how to be a junior officer 101 kind of thing. I did that for 3 years, where I met my wife, which was awesome there. And from there, I went to be executive officer of a larger buoy tender, the Juniper in Newport, Rhode Island. So basically, I had basically 6 years of sea duty in my first. Trying to do the math there, first 9 years of my career. So from there, I kind of had to take a little bit of a break. We had just had our daughter, Abby, who's just about to turn 21, believe it or not.
Wow.
Yeah, time flies, right?
Yeah.
And then I went to graduate school in Indiana for a year to learn what they call, human performance technology or instructional systems technology, basically training and education type stuff. From there, I went to Coast Guard Training Center Cape May, where I'm living now. That was the first time I've been there. I did like a 3-year assignment, kind of managing the academic programs. From there, I went to another Coast Guard cutter out in the Great Lakes again in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, which was absolutely beautiful. I seem to have a way of finding all of these touristy places,
Yeah.
So I did that for a couple of years, and then went to Washington D.C. Right, the party kind of comes to an end, and I was riding the train like everybody into the big city for a few years, and then for my last assignment, I came back to Cape May to be sort of not the I wasn't the commanding officer of the base, but I was in charge of the whole training program as they call it the training officer, training director now. So I that was like the last 4 years of my career, and fantastic. I mean, just couldn't, and all along the way, I've sort of lucked into all of these, amazing things. It worked out well for me. Yeah, and so I retired in 2015. As a commander with like 22 years, and I kind of my boss at the time. He basically told me, like, he says, "What do you want to do with your life after you retire?" And I said, "I really don't know. I might look into teaching or something like that." And he goes, "No." He goes, "No. What we're going to do is we're going to make a job for you, and I'm going to hire you." And he didn't even pose it as though I had a choice. I was like, and so it took a year, but I had kind of a good like little sabbatical there, and I did a lot of honeydew stuff that had been sort of pending for 20 years. Helped my wife out as a teacher and stuff, and then so I came back as a civilian in 2016, and I manage a handful of instructors and a lot of our training program stuff. So been doing that ever since.
Wow. One technical thing. Can you move your microphone a little bit farther away from your mouth? For a little farther away, yeah.
How's that sound?
Yeah,
Better?
that sounds better.
Okay.
Yeah. So many questions to ask.
Yeah.
I'll start. So like when you go out to when you're on those like those sea assignments,
Yeah.
How long is how long are you out? Like for me, like when I was in the Navy, like you might go out for like either a couple weeks, it could be like a month. The longest I ever did was like 3 months. I think roughly 3 months away from home port. What's it like for you?
Yeah, it depends. The Coast Guard has a very wide variety of that. Like we have these ships that go and actually deploy with fleets. They go out for months at a time. That was never my experience. My ships were always, for the most part, out for a week or two at a time. Sometimes, with the ice breaking, on the Great Lakes, you're constrained, like you're burning fuel like it's going out of style, and the sewage tank is filling up, and you can't pump that on the Great Lakes. So, we'd be out for 3 days, back in for a few hours, replenish, back out. So a lot of short trips, and so I guess the plus side of being on the bigger ships is your schedule a little bit better. With the smaller ships, you could get a call in the middle of the night, like a buoy broke loose or some ship got trapped in the ice, and you get ready to sail first thing in the morning type of deal. So our ships are always kind of, the ones I was on were always pretty small deployments. That said, I was on Juniper in Newport, Rhode Island when 9/11 happened. And we immediately like deployed to New York Harbor for months at a time. Like we were there for 30 days on the first stretch, and we just went back repeatedly to do security patrols and that kind of stuff.
Wow. I mean, it's funny, like the way as you're describing the Coast Guard, just correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I perceive it is it sounds like the Coast Guard is almost like a combination of like roadside construction and maintenance plus policing plus military.
Yeah,
Is that
absolutely.
accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Coast Guard, it all started really like in we trace our sort of heritage back to 1790 when Alexander Hamilton, we were Hamilton before the play, before it was cool, right? But Hamilton, when he was Secretary of the Treasury, there was literally no federal presence on the sea, and there was almost no revenue coming into the new country. So they basically put these small sailing ships in 10 different ports to collect revenue when basically the tariffs or whatever. So it was the Revenue Marine, it was what it was called, and later the Revenue Cutter Service. And that's why, if you have a Coast Guard ship that's like 65 feet or greater, they'll call them Coast Guard Cutter. Nothing's being cut. It's basically a type of sailing rig, like a schooner or a bark or whatever. So, you'll have this massive 400-foot ship with all this new technology. We call it a cutter because we kind of trace it all the way back to that. So we have that, and but the life-saving service was an independent thing. The lighthouse service, the steamship inspection service, all these things came together over time, so that by 1915 it was all bundled together to be the Coast Guard. So that's why, yeah, it's crazy. Like it's like that story where three blind men or like touch an elephant and they describe a completely different. One has the trunk, one has the leg, one has the tusk, and like the Coast Guard's exactly like that. I mean, you could be doing this podcast with somebody who had a completely different career from mine, and to me, that's kind of what makes it so cool. There's something for everybody.
Yeah. Well, so I gotta ask, like, ice breaking, like, what is that? What exactly does that entail? And can that be dangerous, like, for the icebreaker itself?
Yeah, I mean, considering that obviously the polar ice breaking with these very large ships is a different thing. I mean, this is a 140-foot tug, so there were a couple times, I mean, not a lot, but there were a couple times in my career where I felt like we were going to get squashed like a bug, by a 1,000-foot ship, and we were okay, obviously, but it can be dangerous, but it's not really as it's not as complicated as some things. I mean, you basically take the ship and you run it at the ice, and you hit the ice with the ship, and you do it over and over again. Yeah, I mean, if the ice isn't too thick, these tugs are designed that we can just run through it, and it creates this huge wake that breaks the ice out for hundreds of yards. But on some days, I mean, I remember there were times we spent days within sight of the same lighthouse, just backing and ramming into this really difficult, depending on what part of the year it was. So Yeah, it's fun. I mean, there's a bit more to it, but it is fun. I mean, it's the only Coast Guard mission that I'm aware of that you're deliberately running your vessel into hard things over and over
that's,
again.
that's like, yeah, that's that, and really in the Navy, like there's no job where you're like, yes,
No,
your job is to go ahead and collide with something.
right. Always a bad option, right?
How far? Did you go into all the Great Lakes? Were you just in one?
No, I did. Broke ice all the way up to Thunder Bay, Ontario, which is really about as far from the Atlantic Ocean as you can get. Up there, out in like Duluth, so all the way on the western edge of the Great Lakes. Uh, Green Bay, right? All lake. The ice kind of really collects right up there in the Straits of Mackinac, like where the two pieces of Michigan come together. So we spent a lot of time there. The St. Mary's River, which links Lake Superior to the lower lakes. Uh, did a little bit of ice breaking east of that, but mostly in the Western Great Lakes. I did have the opportunity to sail out of the Great Lakes one time for a shipyard availability down in Virginia, and that was just an amazing journey because it's the St. Lawrence Seaway is quite a voyage.
Yeah. Oh my
Yeah.
God. What I mean that I mean that's like one of the. I mean, great before the Erie Canal. That was how everything came out of the Midwest, right?
Right, right, yeah, and it still does. I think especially the Canadians, right? Because they don't have like the East Coast ports that we have necessarily, so they have a massive shipping industry that goes in and out of there, and of course we do too. But a lot of the U.S. shipping industry is just internal to the Great Lakes, taking taconite pellets from the mill, where they farm these things up in the Western Great Lakes down to like steel mills and that sort of thing.
Hmm. So it's in some respect, like what you're the job. It sounds like you and one. It sounds like you've mentioned a few times now that like the Coast Guard is very much connected to kind of like I guess inland or like kind of like commerce.
Right.
Is
There's
that
absolutely, and in fact, the it's sort of like the Coast Guard's expensive, like every other military service, right? Like the taxpayers pay an awful lot of money to have us out there, but the bang for the buck is pretty substantial because without the icebreakers on the Great Lakes, large industries and heating oil and coal and stuff for people's safety would be compromised, right? But even on the East Coast and West Coast, where all the ships that are going in and out of those ports, there are captains of the port that manage it. Not quite like an airport, but like there's a Coast Guard captain who's in charge of that port and keeping that open and everything moving is a major effort between the shoreside Coast Guard and then like the buoy tender people like me, so that when somebody comes from the other side of the planet wants to get into Los Angeles, they're following the buoys that we put in there. They're using global positioning system that that our navigation center has a big nexus to. So yeah, it's a huge economic driver. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but they're substantial. They're very substantial. I mean, most of the things that people have got here by sea.
right? And yeah, and with I think about the buoys. I mean, it's such a thing. One of the things that I've been trying to do with the podcast is highlight, I think, things that we all kind of take for granted, right? And for me, like the buoys, it seems like something like nobody pays attention to, right? But it's like so fundamental. It's like if the buoys aren't in the right spots and blinking the right color light and the right intervals, whatever, it's like not having a traffic light that doesn't work. I mean, it could cause so much destruction and death, frankly.
Right, right. I mean, now obviously, what's funny is you mentioned that like at the beginning of my career, we didn't have like GPS. I mean, it
I
existed, but it
remember.
was yeah, it was very
It
limited.
was
You remember?
top secret. It was
I
top
mean,
secret on the
and
Navy ships.
right, and remember how many times on the ship that you were like only about 70% sure of where you were? Like you were fighting to kind of get a good fix of your position so you knew where you were.
Yeah.
So prior to all these modern electronic charting and all this stuff, like keeping those lights lit was like literally a matter of life and death. Fortunately, there's a little more redundancy now with the satellite navigation and everything else, but it's still, I mean, that the pilots and that all rely on what we do. So yeah, it's a great mission.
Wow. Did you ever, when you were around the New York area for 9/11, was
Mhm.
Governor's Island already decommissioned or was it a Coast Guard
Yes.
base?
No, in fact, it was decommissioned. We'd work out of like Bayonne, New Jersey,
Okay.
or sometimes just for sort of like crew rest and just to pull in for a little while. They put these big empty garbage barges alongside the west side. They're kind of like by the Intrepid and those cruise ship piers, and we
Mhm.
actually tied up alongside those sometimes to to do crew transfer transfers and that sort of stuff.
Okay.
But yeah, Governor's Island was closed at that point.
Wow. And I guess to go back to your beginning days, how big is the Coast Guard? How many students at each level at the Coast Guard Academy, like freshmen, sophomores,
Yeah,
or whatever you call it?
I don't know what it is exactly right this moment, but when I went through, it was about 1,000 people total, and
Okay.
more towards obviously the small, like the younger classes were larger, right? I don't know what the attrition is now, but we started with like 291 and graduated 180. So it was quite a, yeah, it was, of course, I attribute a lot of that to it seems like the first summer we went there was like the hottest summer in New England in a very long time. I think a lot of people were just like, nah, I don't want to, there was no air conditioning. They were like, I don't want to deal with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, yeah. So it's about 1,000, pretty small.
And has the Coast Guard stayed like the military? Obviously, like when you mentioned when we first started, like I guess training. When I started at the Penn ROTC unit, we had 200 midshipmen,
Hmm.
but there was also I mean, the Berlin Wall was still up when we first
Right,
started our
right.
respective trainings, and by the time we're done, our unit was down to like 100. Has the Coast Guard, is it kind of a subject to any of the kind of like the growth and contraction of the military services, or is it kind of immune to that because you've always had that same kind of like more like domestic mission?
Well, no, I mean it's sort of an ebbs and flows, but not. I don't think it has the same drivers. In other words, there was. I remember in the mid '90s there was like a streamlining effort to kind of like optimize the size of the force to what the missions were and try to get more bang for the buck. I do remember they did a bit of a drawdown when I was a junior officer, but after 9/11, our mission set really expanded. So there was no effort to make the Coast Guard smaller at that point. So like I said, I don't know what the numbers were, but the service did grow as a result of 9/11. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Because that was when we used to be part of the. I mean, the Coast Guard started in the Treasury Department, and in 1967 went to the Department of Transportation, and then went to Homeland Security after that. So that was a big sea change for us.
Now you never were involved with like kind of like drug interdiction or anything like that. It sounds like.
No, I mean, that's a mission that, in theory, when I was down in Florida, we could have participated in. We didn't. I mean, when I was down there, we came very close to participating in like there was a Cuban migration exodus that we almost got tasked to help out with, and it just worked out that we didn't. But other buoy tenders did because with our deck space and facilities, it was kind of like an ideal support platform for that kind of thing. But no, we never did the drug interdiction on the platforms that I was on.
Okay. And I guess either way, like, do you? We have a friend who has like a boat, and they go out like tuna fishing or something, and he was talking about how he goes like 50 miles off the shore of like Fire Island, right?
Hmm.
And like for a lot of like for I feel like for civilians it just sounds like, oh, that's kind of cool. For me, being in the having been in the Navy, I'm kind of like more like, I like it. I'm more respectful of how
Right.
dangerous the sea is.
The
So what
ocean's
I'm
terrifying.
Yeah. So like what I'm wondering is like from your viewpoint,
Hmm.
did you ever run into like people doing like really like kind of like stupid things where you're like, oh my God, like why?
No, I'll be honest with you. The yes, I have seen people do stupid things, but that was mostly like, for instance, there was when making port in Wisconsin, I had to take my ship through a bridge opening, and it was pretty tight, and so that's a high stress situation, and I don't think people realize that we don't stop on a dime, and if we back down really hard, we kind of lose directional control. You know how it is. You got to have
Yeah.
water over the rudder, right? So, they would open the bridge in Sturgeon Bay kind of every hour on the hour for general traffic, but they would open it for us whenever we requested it. So everybody would try to get through at the same time as us, and we'd have cabin cruisers and Boston whalers like literally cutting in front of us as we're trying to go through there, and it was kind of white knuckle a lot of times. But between that and the people kind of anchoring in the fog in Newport when we were coming in, they would just stop wherever they were and not have a sound signal like they're supposed to and stuff. So that was also a little scary. But once you get out past a certain distance, the professional mariners, I think they recognize the danger, and they would definitely be a lot more careful.
Yeah. One of my mantras with my kids is I'll say to them like, nobody ever plans to have an accident.
Right.
nobody in history. And I think to me that just goes. I feel like in the military that gets so highlighted into because of that looming like physical danger from
Right.
anywhere, and it's
Right.
just and not like putting out human beings, but we can be very stupid.
Right.
That's part of our
Absolutely.
nature. So you have to be aggressively thinking about what the dangers are out there
Yeah.
because they,
Yeah.
they can happen even despite your best efforts.
Right. And I don't know if you ever read it, in your Navy preparation, but you remember Admiral Nimitz put out that letter to the fleet back in after a typhoon had wiped out a bunch of ships, and they said like, there's nothing more dangerous than not wanting to make preparations just in case they don't end up being necessary. You know what I mean? Like you have to get in the mindset of like, yeah, I'm going to do this thing to be prepared and be safe, and it's a win if we don't need it. Whereas like in sort of like day to day life, you hate to pay for insurance that you don't use type of thing, and
Yeah.
it's just a totally different mindset you have to have.
Yeah, and I think that's also one of what you described, or you alluded to, is one of the big differences between like the Navy and the Coast Guard. And I wish I had appreciated that more. But like in the Navy, you're kind of always training
Hmm.
for combat, which you don't ever want to get into.
Right. Right.
Whereas in the Coast Guard, it sounds like a lot of more like your job is doing what you're doing. I'm sure you're
Right.
training as well, but a lot
Right.
you're probably doing a lot more stuff that is not
Right.
an exercise.
Right. Well, it's funny you mentioned that because the reason why I kind of, my parents split up when I was really, really young, and I did the thing where I go to my dad's over the weekend, and so would, just a lot of time with him, and he had been in the Navy, in the 50s, and my brother had been in the Navy in the 80s, so I was kind of like really kind of fired up about doing that. And as I was making my application process to Annapolis, which is like kind of complicated with the congressional stuff and all this. Well, my dad, he just scribbled on a like a piece of paper. It said Director of Admissions, U.S. Coast Guard Academy, and the address. And he said, Matt, you need to look into this. Looks like these guys work for a living. And he could, he's 100% right. That like, we do have plenty of missions that we sort of train for, but yeah, I mean, there's sort of like a day job too that has to be, that we're doing all the time.
Mhm. Now, were there as I'm thinking about the coast, like I mean, I imagine we need Coast Guard everywhere, like even like as far as like the Aleutian Islands and like in
Right.
Alaska and
Right.
everywhere. I mean, there's so many opportunities, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. That it's there's like an Atlantic area and a Pacific area, and those areas are sort of broken down into subunits called districts. And so, I mean, you have District 7, that's way down in Florida. We have, District 17's up in Alaska. We have a district out in Hawaii. So, and actually, there's some, not a ton of units, mind you, but there's stuff out in Guam, like taking care of the Pacific. So, yeah, there's quite a lot. I mean, our bigger ships will deploy with Navy fleets sometimes, but normally it's sort of by those geographic regions.
Now, do you uh, I was just gonna ask something, and I'm totally forgetting it now. Um, can you go between like? Does it matter whether you're Atlantic or Pacific? Can you go anywhere you
No,
want?
no. In fact, it's just a coincidence that I spent my career on the East Coast and the Great Lakes. I mean, I did get out to the West Coast when I was a lieutenant teaching at the academy. I kind of did a couple summers on the Eagle, our big sailing ship, and one of those was all up and down the California coast, which is amazing. But yeah, people bounce back and forth all the time.
Okay. And does the Coast Guard, I mean, by the name, I'm going to assume the answer is no,
Mhm.
but does the Coast Guard get involved at all in like the riverways? Like who's taking care of, who's
No,
the Mississippi or something like that?
right. There is a very active Coast Guard on the they call it the Western Rivers, right? So I mean, it's not like the sort of the jurisdictional issues are well beyond my my expertise, right? But
Yeah.
I mean, the Mississippi River, for instance, there are construction tenders and buoy tenders that keep that waterway marked for traffic. So it's like things that have sort of federal implication between states is kind of what it is. But yes, there is a very vibrant Coast Guard inland as well.
And but so like for the Mississippi and those riverways, who handles like the security, the firefighting, the medical emergencies, like
Oh,
helicopters or, I mean, whatever,
yeah, no, I mean, like I said, I'm not really I'm not
okay.
really up to spend. It's been a
Okay.
while.
But it's not necessarily just the Coast Guard. It's more
No, no, and,
complicated.
and in
Yeah.
fact, it's not just the Coast Guard. It's not just the Coast Guard on like the ocean coast either. I mean, it's there's memorandums of agreement, kind of understandings between state, local, federal. So it is kind of a team effort. I mean, when you look at something like Hurricane Katrina, when there were people trapped in their houses and stuff. Well, there were Coast Guard helicopters pulling those people out of. They'd cut a hole in the roof and they were pulling these people out to safety, and that's not in the ocean, right? That's on land, but we were working together with state and local. So, yeah, there's search and rescue sort of inland is kind of like an Air Force mission, but we have a nexus, when it's close to the water.
Okay. Were you ever in any like particularly like dangerous situations?
Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I was never in anything like combat dangerous, right? But like I said, it's working alongside these large ships in a tiny little tugboat. I mean, when if you ever see some of these freighters on the Great Lakes, they're massive. And there were a couple times where we were a ship was coming towards us, and we would sort of get caught up in the ice that was maybe a little thicker than we were anticipating or whatever. You could get run over. There was a time where we were moving in zero visibility, and we were having problems with the radar, and then we had a steering casualty, and so we were basically drifting sideways down the river in the fog with 1,000-foot freighter coming up the same waterway. That, you know what I mean? So we could have very easily been run over, kind of beamed to, and the captain took action and got out of the way, kind of thing. But it was that was very scary. So there's the sea is always, it's always going to bite you if you're careless.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh
Yeah.
gosh. Do you have to be an engineer when you go to the academy? Like I was a history major.
Oh no. There's a wide variety of majors. I mean, the curriculum, there's a robust core curriculum, as you would imagine, right? And that has a lot of technical classes, some basic engineering for everybody. But no, there's I think it's like government management. There's math and computer science. I think there's even like a cyber program starting. So it's not all. It's certainly not all sort of like the hard engineering of like marine engineering, civil engineering, electrical. Those are big programs, but it's not just that.
Okay. When knowing myself now, one of the things I think would have helped me better, being a history major, was like kind of maybe working almost as an enlisted guy on like a Navy ship, because one of the big challenges I thought first of all, like in the civilian world, there's very little management training. There's a lot of courses and
Yeah.
degrees that refer to managing, but actually managing people,
Right.
very few people do, and from all that I can see, very little people know how to do it.
Right.
We as a young officer or junior officer, you get thrown in and you've got like 15, 20, 30, 40 people that you're literally managing
Right.
people.
Right.
And I feel, and that was a really hard thing, was to manage people who are doing all these different technical things that I didn't know intuitively in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure that must be the same thing for you, even if you have an engineering degree.
Yeah, I mean, to be frank, I took naval architecture and marine engineering was my degree, and really what happened is my first class summer, when I was before I was a senior, I went out on a 210-foot cutter down in Florida, and I saw like the Coast Guard cutter Laurel was a buoy tender pulled into the same port that I was there as a cadet, and I saw the fun that those guys were having, and I talked to them about, because back then there was no fancy assists for the conning officer. I mean, you were driving ships like really like stick and rudder kind of thing, and that really appealed to me. So I mean, by what the Coast Guard would have wanted, they would have wanted me down in the engine room of some big ship, having done that degree, but I kind of betrayed that and went to be a deck watch officer on a buoy tender. So, and that was the same ship that I ended up going on. But so I mean, I didn't really use my engineering at all, other than knowing, if the ship was about to roll over, I could explain in great detail why that was about to happen, But yeah, so I didn't really end up using my degree per se,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But,
So we should talk about your flight training. So
Yeah.
so can you tell how did that get started, and how's that going?
Well, good. So I'm actually I'll start at the start. How about that?
Yeah.
So I told you I had always as a kid, I always loved airplanes. And then of course Top Gun came out when we were in high school. So like a million other guys, probably I was going to be a naval aviator. That was going to be it. And so I wanted to go to the Naval Academy, and I didn't get in there, and I went to the Coast Guard Academy instead. And I had my sights set on being like either a helicopter pilot or maybe flying C-130s or something slick like that. And so back then you had to go to a cutter. When you graduated, you had to do like 2 years at sea, and then you could apply for flight training. So I did my time on the cutter, and I applied. I started my application process, and they did the physical. And back then your eyes had to be really, and there was no such thing as surgery or anything. You had to really had good vision, and I had a lot of astigmatism. So they didn't say no, but the doctor was like, I'm not going to recommend you for a waiver. So that was the end of that, right? So so I kind of progressed through my career and sort of shelved that idea. I don't think I ever really thought when I was younger that I would do it, because it just seemed like a long way off, right? So when I was a lieutenant commander, I had kind of a professional setback, in my career, and I had a little time on my hands where I was like, you know what, maybe this is the time that I can just jump in and try this thing. I'll make it happen. So I actually signed up for one of those, like 1 month accelerated courses down in Florida. I just like jumped on a plane and headed down there. And, it was a huge mistake because like my confidence was already shot. And there I am like, trying to do this thing on an accelerated pace. And it was a bad decision. Right. So, I came back home, and then I transferred to Virginia, and I kind of kept at it. I was flying in Manassas, which is right outside of DC to the southwest. And, unfortunately, then I was really very busy. Like I was working at Coast Guard headquarters, taking the train 5 days a week, and I try to fly on the weekends. And for anybody out there who's thinking about doing flight training, what I would recommend to you is you want to be able to do it a couple times a week. You know what I mean? So you can keep, because if you only do it once every week or once every 2 weeks, you sort of like you take 2 steps forward and a step back if you're lucky, right? So I kept at that until about, I think it was 2010. I just was like, man, this is just not happening. You know what I mean? It's just not going to happen. So I basically just stopped. I kept my logbook, I kept all my stuff, but I just stopped flight training. So, fast forward like 13 years later, my wife was like, you should just go for it. You should do it. And so I did. And I started, it was like October, November of last year. I went up to Millville, New Jersey, where they have this, a fixed base operator up there. And I said, hey, let's jump in a plane and see what I still have. And let's see if I still want to do this thing. And I had a great instructor, this guy, Dennis, who's an older guy, he's like really experienced. And, it was sort of like I was addicted again. I was hooked, from the minute that I did that, And so I just did. I flew like twice a week, throughout the winter. And then, of course, as I got closer and closer to sort of the final evaluation, I was flying like every day just to be prepared for it. But so I actually passed my check ride. I'm a certificated private pilot as of like April 13th. So
congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. So, but of course, that's just the license to learn, right? Like, just enough kind of to, in good conditions, visual flight rules, be that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I mean, the thing that really was, I had to get past the enormity of the task, is what I call it. Like when you look at the airman certification standards, like all the things you have to do and all the things you have to know, and the things the standards you have to perform to, it's very overwhelming. Like it's a lot, and I think that's kind of like I got in my own head back in the when I first tried it. I felt like it's sort of like you have to eat the elephant one bite at a time. You know what I mean? That's my second elephant analogy. I realize that, and I apologize. But yeah, so kind of like, I don't know, maybe just because I'm a little older, have a little more free time, and I could kind of like pace myself, like work on the written test, work on this, work on getting solo flight again, work on doing my cross country trips again, kind of thing. And it was much more successful. It was much more successful on the second try.
And I mean, is I guess the level of knowledge that you have to know for flying, is it like kind of like having to like understand all the aspects of a car and knowing all the different like emergency responses to like 50,000 different possibilities?
Yes, although the good news is it's really, when you're talking about a light training aircraft like a Cessna 172 like I was in, there's really not that many things. I mean, you have to know them really well, but fortunately it's like if you could have, it can catch fire, the engine can stop turning, the electrical system can go out on you. Like there's just a few things, and you have to kind of like, you practice them over and over again, and it gets pretty automatic for you. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Honestly, I didn't have any problems with the knowledge piece. Like you remember, like at school, I was always good at the book work. So I mean, I studied really hard and I got like 100 on the written test. Like it was that was my strength. Where I really needed um, kind of like a little extra effort, a little help was just the physical coordination of making this thing do what you want. I mean,
Hmm.
if people ask me kind of what it's kind of like riding a horse and riding a motorcycle at the same time. Like in other words, the motorcycle because it's like mechanical and you need to know how it works and that sort of thing. And a horse because it's just bouncing all around and doing what it wants to do. Like it's you're guiding it along. It's not like you're always able to sort of drive it, exactly
Hmm.
where you so yeah, it took a while for me to get good at landing, for instance. It's a thing that you just have to do hundreds of times before you can be good at it. And I'm not really great at it. Under ideal conditions, I can make very nice landings.
Uh-huh.
But the wind is always blowing. So you have to kind of get good at that too.
Huh. It's like I guess to analogize it to at least what I think you're talking about is it like I was trying to explain to my son what like how easy or hard driving is, and I was like, it's really like the difference between a new driver and an experienced driver is like the braking. Like
Hmm.
it's just there's a touch. You can't
Right,
teach how
right,
to brake gently. You just have to do it a lot,
right.
and it
Absolutely, and
sounds like that.
yes, absolutely. And in fact, there's that's really what flying is developing. It's developing that sense of how much pressure to put on the controls to get what you want out of it. And unfortunately, there's some sort of negative transfer when you talk about driving versus flying. Like for instance, when you're on the ground on a plane, you're driving around using your feet. You're not you turn the yoke just to keep the wings from getting picked up by the wind, but you're steering left and right with your feet, and it takes people a while to
Oh
yeah,
wow.
yeah. And then you're using the brakes gently sometimes to help you taxi around in it. And when I was and I'm still not super at it, but like I'll tell you, like using the brakes at first, I was always either overdoing it or underdoing it. And so yeah, you develop a feel though. You absolutely develop a
Wow.
feel.
So how high are you like licensed to fly, or like is that how
Oh
does
no,
that work?
well, so a private pilot certificate really it allows you to fly under visual flight rules, which is by definition going to be less than 18,000 feet, right? Because once you're 18,000 feet and above, you're up with the airliners and the jets and stuff like that. So you have to be on an instrument flight rules plan for that. I'm not certified to that, so I can fly anywhere up to 18,000 feet basically. Um, and normally though, with these the planes that we fly, they're not like supercharged or turbocharged engines, so they start to run out of gas or like power when you get to about 12,000 feet. So you're going to stay lower than that. Typically, when I do my flights, I cruise at like 6,500 or 5,500 feet, and that's a nice altitude because you're kind of above a lot of the training traffic. But you're not, because obviously too once you get up into the higher altitude, now you're worried about hypoxia, right? Like if you're at like 10,000 feet and above, your oxygen that you're getting is less too. So you have to you have to manage that.
Hmm. And how fast are you going?
The plane cruises about 105 knots or 110 knots through the air. So depending on what the wind is like, you could be really going fast or you could be going really slow. Like
Wow.
I did a flight the other about a month ago where there was like about a 40 knot wind at 5,000 feet or whatever. So I'm just like crawling along, like I'm looking down at the scenery, and it feels like we're not moving at all because we're bucking that pretty strong headwind. So it was depending on what the winds are doing, your speed over ground can vary quite a bit.
Wow. So yeah, so your speedometer or whatever could be showing 105 knots, but if you have 40 knots pushing against you, you're really only doing 60.
Right, right, and so your airspeed indicator is just really telling you how fast you're going against the air that you're in, and
Right.
so you can. Fortunately, these planes have the GPS and stuff, and I have it's amazing the technology. Like you talk about when we were on the ships and we were using bearings and radar ranges and throwing a rock on a string to see how how deep the water is.
Yeah.
I mean, now on my iPad, I have a little thing I suction cup to the window that has GPS and traffic and avoidance and stuff, and you're on your iPad and you can see everything. You can see exactly how fast you're going, where you are, and everything's just amazing. I mean, you got to be careful not to over rely on that technology, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's just amazing the stuff they have now.
Wow.
It makes it fun, and it also makes it safer because planes have these little beacons on them basically that you can see each other on your little screen. So obviously you can't not everybody has to have that, so you have to keep your eyes outside, but it's nice the stuff that they have.
Yeah. So is that, I guess, why did what is it that about flying that really, like, I guess, allured you? And then is there any moments where you've been flying where you're like, this is why I do it? Like where you're just like, you know,
Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, like I said, since I was a little kid, they've always
mhm,
fascinated me. And then,
mhm.
being up in the air, seeing things from the air is just awesome, and I haven't gotten tired of it yet.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's what I'm in it for. Like the other day I went down to Salisbury, Maryland, and back, and it was like the most beautiful day. And just seeing that, that Delmarva Peninsula is just amazing. And last week I took my daughter Abby up. We went around Cape May Point, and came back. So that's really, I mean, that's what really does it for me, is just being up there. There's also another piece of it. I think, like, there's sort of like this element of danger. I mean, it's not super, I wouldn't call it super dangerous, especially not what I'm doing. Um, but you have to be so focused. You know what I mean? Like there's a focus that you have when you're doing this task, and I don't know. I think I respond well to it. I like it. You know what I mean? It's just something that it just feels good to do. That's really
Yeah.
like, and especially too, like when you make a really nice landing or something like that, it's just very satisfying to do that. I haven't had too many of those, mind you, but
All the more. It's will
right.
be satisfying.
Yep.
Are you familiar with the book Our Towns?
I have heard of it, but I don't know if I've actually read it recently yet.
Okay. Yeah, I know. It's about two writers for the Atlantic, a husband and
Mm.
wife team that have their own little, like, kind of propeller plane, and
Oh,
they
nice.
fly all over the country. And I guess they're kind of like, the way they explain it is like when you're flying, you get that kind of like you get like that literal bird's eye view of the
Hmm.
country. So it's really fascinating to see how things like kind of unfold and how the landscape
Yeah.
evolves as you go from one area to another.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had an actual example of that when I took my daughter. I took her up, and she was amazed at what Cape May County looked like from the air. Like, you get this impression of, when you're driving on the Parkway, you see kind of 100 yards to each side. You don't really get an idea of just how varied. It's they call it the Garden State for a reason. It's super rural down here, and it's just beautiful. And she was really blown away in the sense that. Just a completely different perspective, on what she was looking at. And
Yeah.
that's what I really like. I mean, I enjoy flying over kind of the more rural areas, like the less developed. I mean, I flew up to Trenton and back, and like flying over a bunch of buildings and stuff, just it's not quite as, to me, as satisfying. Plus, it's a little more scary because if you have to emergency land somewhere, like you're going to land on the New Jersey Turnpike or something, which is not really great.
Yeah. um, what is it? I mean, I guess, like, if there is an accident that happens, like I think intuitively you just kind of think, oh, you'll just kind of glide down
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
land somewhere. Is that kind of one of the things that's possible? I would seem it would seem pretty hard for you to just kind of all of a sudden just plummet from the
Oh yeah,
sky. Yeah.
no. In fact, what's so funny is one of the things that sort of struck me when we started first doing these emergency engine out procedures is you trim the plane to fly at its best glide speed, and and you just kind of wait. Like, there, you have a lot of time when you're up at 3,000 feet or 5,000 feet. Like, you have a little bit of time to figure out what you're going to do. It doesn't just drop like a rock. It actually just keeps flying unless you do something, like if you were to pull back on the stick a lot and make the wing lose lift, then it would fall like a rock. But
Mhm.
we train specifically not to do that. And with these, specifically with something like a Cessna 172, I mean, the thing just wants to fly all the time. So you just, as long as you keep your head about you, you really, this, it's really just, you know, if people panic and they try to, like, you know, stretch their glide further than they should or something like that, that's when things get really bad. But yeah, there's a lot of time usually to you keep your head, find a decent field below you, and just start setting up for it.
Okay. Now, are you on Instagram so we can follow your, like, kind of your journey by photographs and
I
video?
am. I have an Instagram account. I normally just have been posting to my Facebook page, as you've
Okay.
seen. But yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, maybe I should. Maybe, I need to become an influencer. That's what I need to
A pilot influencer, or maybe a
do.
Coast Guard influencer, or
That's
both.
right. That's right. Yeah.
So, and it's interesting. You're talking about New Jersey.
Yeah.
When we went down to Cape May a few years ago, and one of the things that I found surprising was how far south the Cape May is. Like Cape May is farther
Right.
south than Washington D.C.
Right. It is way down there. And the funny thing about Cape May is nobody ever goes there unless they're actually going there. Like nobody's just passing through. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you have to really want. I mean, maybe if you're taking the ferry or something, but people. If you live in the Washington D.C. area, you'll have friends driving by. Like they're going from the south to the north, back and forth. But like people have to make an effort to go to Cape May. Like you have to get down there to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The and how long have you been? Have you lived there just since retirement, or were you?
No, like I said, when I got that last assignment, it was in
Okay.
2011. So
Okay.
we basically and at that point, we kind of made a conscious decision that this is where we were going to settle down. Like we had
Okay.
lived here, for 3 years, from like 2003 to 2006, and we liked it. We were further south,
Mhm.
and then. In 2011, we kind of said this is where we're going to put our roots down, and we bought a house and everything else. So yeah.
Wow.
Because we want, how it is with having kids and stuff, and we wanted our daughter to kind of have some stability because she had moved around quite a bit as a little kid, and every time she would have to kind of like reestablish her roots in each new place. So it was just nice to she would have been about 9 years old at that point. She could kind of have a little more normal existence.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned New Jersey and how why it's the Garden State. One of the missions of the podcast is really trying to get people to understand areas for what they are and not how
Yeah.
we perceive them to be, either through
Right.
the filters we live in or the images that are like focusing on us. And I think like New Jersey has got like the bad name of like the Jersey Shore kind of all of a sudden defines everybody's understanding of New Jersey. It's obviously not that.
Right. I mean,
If you
and I remember specifically growing up in New York, right? All we knew of New Jersey were those like refineries on the
yeah,
other side of the river, like
yeah,
just all this nasty industrial, so if you lived on Long Island, all you saw of New Jersey was when you went up and over, you saw all
yeah,
that stuff, and that's all we knew, right?
yeah.
And then of course the coastline is probably what a lot of people only think of. But yeah, inland in New Jersey, it's very rural, very agricultural. You know what I mean? It has like Cumberland County. My wife taught high school up there for a year when she was first learning, first getting set up as a teacher,
Mm.
and it was like 4-H and like straight up learning people who are going to be going into farming and stuff. So it's definitely like a wide contrast, depending on where you go.
Yeah. Have you do you drive all around Jersey or do you stay usually in the South?
Yeah, I mean, I typically, when we go to visit Abby up in upstate New York, we do the whole length of the
Yeah.
state, so you kind of
Yeah.
gradually becomes more and more New York City as you get
Yeah.
closer to it. And then whenever I want to go somewhere south, I typically, if I don't take the ferry, I'll go up and over like into the Delaware Memorial Bridge, and that takes you right through, the heart of the agricultural area. So yeah, I get a good view of both. And of course, since I've been flying, you really get to see it all.
Yeah. What's the range when you fly actually, now that you
Oh,
mentioned that?
I mean, you can fly. I mean, it depends. You can fly maybe 4 or 5 hours if you plan out your trip well. So, do the math on that. You're talking maybe 400 miles or something like that.
Mhm.
Obviously, there is no restroom facility on board, and it can be physically taxing if it's a lot of turbulence and bumpy and stuff. So, the longest I've ever flown was about an hour or so in one leg, just because by then it's time to come down anyway. A lot of people who I watch a lot of Facebook. I mean, I'm sorry, a lot of YouTube videos from instructors and things, and a lot of people have kind of boiled down about 3 hours is kind of a good mission length, because that way you don't have to really worry about your fuel endurance getting tight, and you can refresh. Take
Mhm.
take a break.
Do they have like espresso machines in the airplanes?
No, I'll tell you. I recommend if especially if anyone is afraid of airline flying, I recommend that everyone should take a flight in like a little Cessna. I mean, you're literally shoulder to shoulder with the other person, and like there's a window, and you're like looking out into it's awesome. It's like I said, it's like having a Jeep that goes in the air. It's not
Yeah.
big at all.
I feel like there would be that. I mean, it sounds like you're very like the barrier between you and open air seems
Right.
very thin
Yeah,
compared to being
exactly.
in a passenger plane.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the things I love just about because the Cessna has like a high wing, I love looking down and seeing that wheel just hanging out in space. Like the left landing gear is
Oh
just
my
hanging out
god.
in space there. I don't know. I love it. I take pictures of it all the time. People are like, why are you posting another picture of that wheel? I just think it's funny. But yeah, I mean, you really are. You really feel connected to it. You really feel connected to it, and
Yeah.
it's great.
So can you, once you have your license, is it just a matter of like, are you renting planes? Do you have to buy a plane? Like, how do you kind of keep this
Right, right.
vacation going?
You're asking the $150,000 question, right? I don't know what I'm going to do. I mean, right now I'm renting
Mm,
because when you rent from a place, you kind of have to get checked out by them because their insurance company will typically make sure that they evaluate you to make sure that you're going to be safe with their plane and stuff. So, I mean, since I trained with them, I'm good to go. I can fly their stuff. So I rent from them. I don't know what the future is going to hold. If I really had unlimited resources, I would love to buy a small plane and keep it in a hangar and just take it out to do these, weekly trips, just around this area because I think that would be super fun. Probably a more realistic scenario for most people is maybe joining like if you and a few other friends go in on something or you join a flying club where everybody contributes to the maintenance and upkeep expenses
mhm.
of a plane. That's probably more realistic. I mean, because of there's sort of a scarcity of small planes, believe it or not. The ones that like the flight schools really want to use things like the Cessna 172 for flight training. So the price of those is astronomical. Like to buy a new one is like close to $500,000 if you have,
Wow.
or maybe $300,000 or $400,000. Which, when you look at it, when you consider how small it is and is really not that technically advanced. Even planes that are 50 years old, if they're in good condition and the maintenance records are perfect, people can get $150,000 for those or more. That's just it's crazy.
Wow. What did the it seemed like, actually, you made me think of in Alaska, one of the things that I was surprised to learn about, and this is just more like I would have no reason to think about it, but like in Alaska, the primary way people get around through a lot of those towns is by airplane.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. When I was a cadet in the summer of 1991, it was right after the Valdez oil spill, if you recall, and I kind of got sent up on what they would now call an internship. But it was just sort of like a summer program. Me and three other cadets went up, and that's what we did. We went to all these various places, and it was all by helicopter because if there were roads, it was going to be a pretty extreme drive.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I really got a sense for that. There's a lot of very remote places there.
Now, is the kind of plane that you could buy? Would it be big enough for you to be able to like put your family and luggage and just kind of like go on vacation for a week or two and fly from town to town?
Well, the probably not in a Cessna 172. Like there are four seats in it, but if you take four adults in a plane like that, you're going to have very little weight left for fuel. Everything is weight
Ah,
in aviation,
okay.
right? Like there's plenty of room to put baggage, but there's not enough weight allowance. So yeah, you'd have to have like there's a Cessna 182, which has a lot more capability. 206. There's like some bigger versions of the same thing. Uh, but yeah, so the plane that I fly is really a trainer and sort of like a short, day trip kind of thing. Now, a Cessna 172 with two people, yeah, you could go full fuel tanks and actually carry some bags with you.
Mhm. With the way you're describing airplanes, that with my understanding if about how cars were like used back in like the
Hmm.
1910s and 20s, and it explains that great question of why do you drive in a parkway and park in a driveway, is
Right,
because like the parkway was supposed to be like a leisurely way to the park,
right,
and people would actually just use their car for like leisure driving, like that was
right.
like the relaxation. And it sounds like the way you're referring to the airplane is
Hmm.
not really I mean, there is practical reasons, but
Right.
for your purposes it's more about just kind of getting up there and like the
Yeah.
leisure.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not what's called an instrument rated pilot. So
Mhm.
if I have to have relatively good weather. In other words, clear skies. I can't fly through a cloud, right?
Mhm.
So um, and that's one of those things where if you want to use an airplane as a legitimate method of transportation, you'd probably want to get your instrument rating, because that way you can sort of meet a schedule. You know what I mean? Like if it's, obviously if it's icing conditions or something, that's something else. But if it's a nice summer day that happens to be overcast and I need to get somewhere, if I was instrument rated, that's a mission you could do on this kind of plane. But,
Right.
I think a lot of people too, to be honest with you, a lot of times when people get themselves into trouble is when they set expectations for themselves that are not realistic. Like they're like, hey, we've got to get there, get there-itis. And so, they want to fly somewhere, and they talk themselves into a situation where they bit off more than they can chew, and now they're in danger. You know what I mean? So yeah, I mean, just more training, and ultimately, if you're really, there are better planes for that purpose that people have, and if they're instrument rated and they have a capable airframe, they can use it as a transportation. But that's not where I'm going with it.
Yeah, no, I love the idea of just doing something just for, not for efficiency purposes, but
Right.
just
Oh,
to
yeah.
relax,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly.
You deserve it.
Well, thank you.
So, well, we're starting to approach the hour
Yeah.
mark here, but so I should let you go. But I like to wrap these these podcasts up by just asking, like, can I ask, like, what gives you hope at the end of the day?
What gives me hope is the quality of people that I have been fortunate enough to be associated with. Like sometimes I look around, I work with, half a dozen instructors, and I plug into some of the officers that are in charge of the base, and basically the quality of people that I've been associated with over the last 35 years, that's really what gives me hope. You see, and I know you've spoken to this a lot, in your podcast and such, but we get the extremes, like the loudest mouths, and so it's easy to form kind of like a very one-dimensional view of what people are. But the people that I've, all the people that I've dealt with all these years, they're fantastic. You know what I mean? And so, they're out there. These people are out there that are awesome. And I know a lot of them I probably don't share the same political views as a lot of them, right? But it doesn't matter, right? Because we're all, we all have the thing in common, right? If we could sort of get that attitude of like we're all in the Coast Guard together, if we could get that attitude for like we're all in the U.S. together, I think it would be a much different place. So yeah, I think that's what gives me hope, is just I know that they're out there, and they're just not loud because they're too busy doing the good things that they need to be doing, and they're not sitting on the internet 12 hours a day like ranting about whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, you're not following my Instagram handle this week.
Right.
No. I'm doing a fundraiser. We got American Military's got its 501c3 certification, so my wife is like worried about me. She's like, "You're doing this too much." I'm like, "Look, just 1 week, I got to do this."
That's right. It's a media blitz, right?
Yeah,
No, I mean, and you know what I mean. That wasn't directed at you.
Yeah, I understood. No, I think it's true, and I think like that's my perception too, is like, and I think it's more like one of the things that I keep kind of returning to is that idea of, and maybe it's like, words are cheap now because you can just kind of just put them out there.
Right.
So a lot of people, I don't know what the changes, I know this technology, but I don't know if people have changed, but I think like words are cheap. And I think that it's more important that you do something than that you say something.
Yeah.
And I understand like communication is also important, but I think we need to write that balance between what you're posting online and what you're doing, and if there's not some kind of like alignment between what you say you're concerned about and how you actually live your life, then you need to like rebalance that.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite jokes, it's kind of like a meme that people post, is we thought that if we had unlimited ability to communicate, it would solve all of our problems, and clearly that has not been the case, right? If only people could be heard, and it didn't work out like that at all, right?
I think like to me, like the way I look at it is more like we're all these bubbles we all live in. Like I mean, I'm frustrated with the bubble of New York City. I love New York City. I've been here since '97, but it's a bubble. And I think that in the past, everybody lived in their own little bubble, and you just didn't know about the other bubbles. And now all of a sudden, we're being connected to those other people. So you've all of a sudden discovered, wait, people on Long Island have different values and different concerns than people in the city, or people in South Jersey are different. Yeah, they are. They always were. You just never really heard about it. You only met them on those, like in those neutral settings, and you didn't see when they were talking with their friends about the problems that they feel or that the values they have, because that just didn't come. But now we're seeing it, and we're like, wait a second, wow, I didn't know that. But
Right.
I don't. I think it's. In many respects, I think it's. I think it's. I think we're talked into a state of polarization more than I think we actually are.
Oh
And I
yeah.
think that I'm trying, obviously, with this podcast, to be less worried about it and more curious about those differences and
Right.
more embracing and understanding of them, even and maybe especially when they're different values than my own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not like a big conspiracy guy, right?
Uh-huh.
But I mean, I do when I look at the things that pop up in my news feed, and like even just launching any browser, beneath the search bar, there's all those news stories.
Mm.
And they're always things that like I read the headline and I start to react negatively to
Yeah.
it, right? They're not picking things that are making me happy. They're like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just like that. I bet if I click that, I'm going to read it and I'm going to be upset. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? So I think you're right. There's when they get paid by the engagement, what engages people is what fires them up, what gets them angry. So I think, that pushes us into only being thinking about the negative differences or the negative things, as opposed to you could have a whole set of good stories under there and but there aren't.
Well, when to take it back to like human nature, I think there are
Mhm.
two things. One, the idea of yellow journalism and
Yeah.
sensationalizing is old practice.
Yeah,
So in that
absolutely.
respect, it's not new. But I think the other thing is like even like when we were in like high school, like nobody gathers around to watch the kids that are working well together, right?
Right.
But if there's a fight out in the back, in the back, then you're going to get a crowd. And I think
Right.
again, it's like kind of human nature, and I think
Yeah.
maybe it's something that we get more impressed upon, like us, if we're like, since we were in like the service.
Right.
But there's this idea of like kind of like responsibility, where it's like, what, like we are more interconnected. You feel that when you're on that ship and you realize that the most junior person is as important as the most senior person, and
Yeah,
that we're all
absolutely.
interdependent, interconnected. But you also, that means you got to take responsibility for your impact on other people. And I
Yeah.
think that's where it's like, what, it's great that we have this ability to go on Facebook and share our opinions.
Hmm.
But maybe there are things we don't need to rant about, even if you
Right.
feel it. Maybe just mention it to your spouse or to your friend over a beer, but maybe you don't need to rail about it.
Right. There's no you're not obligated to react to everything.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And you certainly have a right to react to everything, but I think if we want to fix things, we have to kind of reorient ourselves collectively to that idea. So,
Yeah.
well, thank you so much for that, man. I really
Yeah.
appreciate it, and this has been a lot of fun, and it's really educational, informative. I
All
really
right.
appreciate it. So,
Thanks
thank
for
you.
having me. It was a good time.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to all the listeners and viewers out there. May you go out and explore our country with curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility. All right. Take care, Matt. Thank you so much.
Thank you.